Alright, now, you said you wanted to get everything organized, so you can find everything? That's not my preference. I prefer to take my notes, throw them in a big pile, and then play the game just to see what happens. My favorite part is whenever I get to scrounge around on the floor looking for that one monster spec that I made and taking 15 minutes to do it. My players love it. It's like suspense.
Thanks for joining us today for GM Tips with Raven's Maw. This is our series on getting your campaign started from scratch, and today's episode is all about campaign organization. All right, thanks again for joining us today. I'm Ravensmaw, and we're going to be talking about campaign organization, and we're going to use our practice campaign that we've already started as a model. But before we get there, let's talk about the basic building blocks of organization. The first thing you need to talk about in a campaign is the types of entries that you may use. Now, when I got started as a GM, I was not very organized. I had some ideas in my head. I wanted to either get them onto a spiral notebook or onto a Google Doc or something like that. I found a campaign manager that I could use to get my thoughts organized, but I have to be honest, I was not very organized in how I threw it all in there. As I thought of things, I just tossed it in. What I should have done from the very, very beginning is back up a little bit, take some of those entries and get them organized into different buckets, categories, things like that. So let's talk a little bit about the kinds of things that we start with in the basic types of organization. Right? The first thing that you might think of is a great NPC, a character monster, a bad guy, a master villain, a nemesis, and you just want to kind of get it out there and get it written down. Characters come in all shapes and sorts, but that is one of the basic building blocks of a great story and a great campaign. Right, then you've got your places. That's actually where I started. I had this place in mind. I called it Sicaria. I hadn't even drawn it out in a hand-drawn map yet, but I had an idea of what I wanted it to be like, and I just started typing. Away and getting those thoughts down into an entry, right? The next thing that I actually had in my mind was an item that I wanted to base my campaign around, this artifact that needed to be pieced together, and I thought, oh, this would be really cool. There'll be lots of different adventures and lots of different quests where the PCs go out and get pieces of this item to turn it into this massive artifact that could take on the gods, right? I thought that'd be kind of fun, a little hooky, but still, it was a good idea that I felt like I had as a GM. Right? Then you've got your events. These were things I'm thinking about. Okay, so what led up to the creation of this artifact, and how did this place come to be, and what kinds of things have happened that led up to this? These events, these happenings that happened in the past, right? So your campaign history. Events can also be the things that happen during the course of your campaign, your adventures as they happen, and things like that, the encounters and all that kind of stuff. So there's lots of great stuff that happens in the happenings. So you got the people, you got the places, you got these items, which can be very important to your campaign. And then you've also got the things that happen, the history and the adventures themselves. Okay? Well, there's another way to start thinking about this information, and that is to think about your information in the context of buckets or containers of these other things, right? So containers of characters, containers of places, containers of items and events. Well, there's a few different types that you can use. You can have a group, right, which is a collection of characters. You have the PC group, obviously, but then you may also have groups of NPCs, and they may be a criminal organization or a line of royals or something like that. It doesn't matter, as a starship with the crew. These can all be groups that you can start to group together your characters into, okay? And they have particular ideals, and you want to write those down. Then, in addition to that, you have collections of thoughts that don't really fit into these categories. These might be your game house rules. They might be notes on climate. They might be notes on travel rules that you're going to use throughout your campaign. They might be notes that are essentially like a book that you're writing, a poem, a prophecy, or something like that has an integral part in your campaign, but it doesn't really fit in these other categories, and so you want to write it down as a note. So we'll just call those notes. Just these are ideas or important information that you need to catalog and categorize. Okay? Okay. And then you've got folders. Now, this is a collection of any of these things all together. I mean, if you have a particular adventure, maybe you want to throw everything that relates to that adventure in there, a dungeon, or maybe you've got a city or a town. You want to toss everything that relates to that city and town in there. So you can kind of collect things together so that they're easier to find. We're just going to call these folders. It really does help to make things get organized. But there is the basic building block of a great role-playing game. And if you've seen my other videos, you know I think the basic building block of a campaign is game night. Game night. That event that people, your friends or people that you know, show up for, hoping to have a great, inspiring, memorable, life-changing, maybe not life-changing, but memorable time that really is fun for them, right? And putting together a great game night isn't in and of itself a big challenge, but it is the number one challenge for a game master. And the basic building block of a great game night, hopefully, is the adventure. Now, it might be a couple of game nights in an adventure. It might take a couple of games to get through a dungeon or to travel somewhere. But that adventure is how you get your thoughts together beforehand, before you get to the game night, so that when they get to that experience of the game night, it's fun and interesting, and you have a plan to keep the game moving along, right? So that's how we do our planning. So the basic building block of any great campaign is the adventure, and an adventure contains all of those other things. It's kind of its own kind of container. Peoples, places, events, notes, folders, everything, groups, all end up tossed into an adventure. Right? And that's the bundle that we share with our players. Now, the next part of campaign organization is a level beyond what we just talked about there. And that is your roles and your categories. And in just a moment, I'm going to show you how to use this online system, Scabard RPG Campaign Manager. You can use any campaign manager you want to do this. You can do it in a spiral notebook, doesn't matter. But you can use the same kind of organization technique to get things organized in your campaign. Your characters should have roles, all right? We're going to talk about the kinds of different roles that we're going to use. In addition to that, your places, your items, your events, they can fall into categories that can help you get organized. Then you can develop folders that, I mentioned that the adventure is kind of a folder in and of itself, right? Contains a lot of these things, right? And then in addition to that, you might have books, which is something I love to have in my campaigns. I have ideas or historical documents, and I toss them into something like, the complete history of Sicaria or something like that. And we're going to read the prophecy from the great history of Sicaria. Something like that. You might want to toss those notes into your folder, all right? And you can have other folders too. We'll talk about some of those. Okay. Enough notes. Let's dive into the campaign so that you can get your thoughts organized from the very beginning of your process. Okay, here we are, the War of the Mountain Gods. This is our practice campaign inside Scabard RPG Campaign Manager. And since the last time we worked on this, I've done some fleshing out of this campaign just to get some ideas out into the big wide world and also give us some things to work with today. So let's take a look at this here. We've got several new entries that I've added to our campaign. And here on the tabs at the bottom, we've got the TOC, or the table of contents. So let's take a look at that. You can see now we actually have a few characters to work with. If you saw my last video, we didn't have this many last time. I've got some places, some notes, an event, an item, and an adventure in here, which we kind of worked on last time. All right, so we're going to start with characters, right? So we talked about the fact that your characters come in all shapes and sizes, and one of the first things you should do once you start getting things out there, either on paper or Google Doc or in a campaign manager like this, is you need to figure out what your roles are, all right? So I've got a few in here. Let's click on Eliza Crod. All right. Eliza Crod is the daughter of General Crod, and you can see here her father, General Crod. She's involved in this. I put her in a folder here to get things organized, and she's a participant of an adventure called Save Crod's Daughter. All right. You can see on the family list here that there's a parent, General Crod, there, because that's her his daughter. So we can go in and add to some of these connections. And one of the connections we want to add is, what is General Crod's daughter's role? What's Eliza's role in the campaign? All right. So in the roles, you will see a lot of different categories, for example, that other people, other users have added in here over time. Some are pretty basic, right? So NPC ally. You might also see villain, right? And they're minor villain, master villain, just regular villain. All right, well, this is going to be an ally of the NPCs, an important part of our entire storyline. So I'm actually going to add ally in here as Eliza Crod's role. I'm going to save that. All right, so now we've got a role for one of our NPCs, and you'll see on the right-hand side, it's listed as role. Well, this is something that you can click into. So I'm actually going to click into role here, and if you look up here at the top, so there's our breadcrumbs there. War of the Mountain Gods role, NPC, and this is a sub role of NPC. So I've actually got 2 layers of organization here, right? I've got NPCs that are both allies and some might be villains, okay? If you wanted to add another role, say you've got some really cool creativity that's going on in your brain and you'd like to get things organized in different kinds of buckets, you can do that with custom connections, what is called custom categories, and you would simply click new category here of a different type of NPC. Now, I would encourage you not to do too much of this. Be broad with your buckets. Ally, NPCs. You want to be able to click on that role and see all of the allies in your campaign, and you don't want to have to click through too many places because you want to be able to find them very quickly. So I just recommend pick your roles early and figure out what they are early so that your organizational structure continues to make sense to you and to your players who want to dig around in your campaign. Let's go back to the characters here. I'm going to click on the characters button here, and you'll see all the characters that I've got created. So let's add another role just to show you how that's done one more time. We're going to go to Belian. Belian is the goddess of Mount Bel, and she's going to be important in this campaign I'm kind of making up as I go along. And we're going to add a role for this, very simple. In my campaign, a god is going to be called a god. And we'll click that, and that is now Belian's role. So let's add another role for one of my other gods. So we'll go over to characters again, which, by the way, I could have done that. I'm just going to go back and show you. I could have gone to characters, not by going here, but actually just by clicking right there on the breadcrumbs, which is kind of handy. So we'll click that. I'm going to go down to my other god that I created, Borash. And we're going to make this one God right there. Oh, look, I've already done that. I must have gotten prepared for this video even more than I thought I was. And we'll click on the role God. So now when we click on the role God, you see I've got Belian and I've got Barash. Now it's going to be really cool as your campaign grows and grows and grows, and you have this whole pantheon of gods. They'll all be listed right there. Pretty cool. So let's go back to our characters. We've got one more we need to mess with here, and that is our bad guy, Maljaran, or whatever the players decide to call him. I'll probably go with that, right? Let's add a role in for this person, this character. This is going to be an adversary. That's what we're going to call them in this campaign. You can pick whatever you want, master villain, nemesis, ultimate bad guy, BBEG, whatever you decide to call them, that's great. Just stick with it and keep it up as you go along. Otherwise, you'll end up with a big old mess, right? So keep your buckets solid, name them, and stick with them throughout your campaign. So we'll save that in there. And now we've got, in our characters, this is going to be kind of cool. Check this out. I can go to my characters here. Here's all my characters, and I click on the table of contents, and notice now it is divided out into my roles. So as I move along, that's going to be really helpful to keep things organized. All right, so let's go back to the very beginning here. We'll go back to War of the Mountain Gods, and we're going to look at something else here, and that is, those are roles. Let's look at a category, okay? In this case, we're going to use the blood fields, all right? And this is a place category that I've added in here called a sub-region. All right, one of my other videos coming up is I've got a map. We'll talk about using maps in here and talk about regions versus sub-regions. But it's important as you get started to think about what types of place categories you might have. So I'm going to show you some of the places you can do in here. So you can have battlements. We could have a dungeon, right? You could choose a dungeon in here. So keep these organized if you can. Obviously, one that I use a lot is either city or village to keep that organized, or town. Town is very simple. Oops, can't spell. TOWN, and you can see there's a lot of towns and villages already. If what you're looking for isn't coming up in this list, you can create a custom category by going to that section of places, and I'll show you how to do that in just a second. One that I use a lot, shop. Use shop a lot for all the different places, so I can keep all my shops in one location. Sometimes I just duplicate a shop, I'll copy it and change the name, and I've got my blacksmith or my my general goods store, right? So actually, we don't actually want to call that a shop quite yet. We'll get rid of that. And let's go back to the blood fields. I'm going to show you the different categories you can choose from here. So I'm going to click on place category, and you can see right here it's region. Right, and then this is a sub-region. I want to click on place categories in the breadcrumbs right there, and I want to show you this is how many place categories I've used right now in my campaign. So it would list them all right down here on the right hand side as a kind of filter. You can also click all, and this will show you ones that have been used all across the whole system. And it goes on and on forever, but you might get some ideas: demi-plane, desert, and empire, things like that. So if you need some brainstorming ideas, this is a good way to get some brainstorming done. All right, let's go back to War of the Mountain Gods, because now we've talked about roles, we've talked about categories, and the categories can be used for places. They can also be used for items. So for example, the Crystal Saber is an item in my campaign, and I might want to quickly call that a artifact. And I do make a distinction between an artifact and loot. Those are really just my two categories of item types. I try to keep it nice and simple buckets. Artifacts are important to the storyline of the campaign. All right, they might be important to the finishing of an adventure. An artifact, something that's vital or important to the story. Loot, stuff the player characters get and use, like money or jewels or a ring of warmth or something like that. That doesn't really play a huge part in my campaign. If it does, I change it to an artifact. Keep your buckets simple. That's what I recommend. All right, so we've added a category for our item now, and let's move back to the War of the Mountain Gods and talk a little bit about adventures. Adventures are collections of a variety of different types of entries. I have another video that goes through the adventure builder, which is a really cool technique for getting your thoughts started. Basically, it gives you 30, 40 plots to choose from, and you can use those plots to get your brain moving. But remember, all those are just outlines, and it's really just about telling a story, and then your adventure becomes a container for all those things. And I want to show you one other way to make a container. I do have some notes in here. I've got the Prophecy of the Innocent Star. I've got my campaign plan. One of the things that I think is kind of cool is to set up a book in my campaign where I'm going to put things like the Prophecy of the Innocent Star. We'll talk about this in another video about using things like a prophecy to keep your story moving, to keep things moving along with destiny and fate like that. And you can create a quick folder by going into connections, and we're going to call this this is going to be a sub note of, and we're going to call this the Book of the War of the Mountains. A history of the mountain wars. Simple, right? And now every time I create a note that I think would be kind of cool, if they discover a copy of this book somewhere, they might find this located somewhere in a dungeon or something like that. I can say, oh, you found a copy of the book here, the Book of the War of the Mountains. Do you want to read through it and see what you find? So it's a nice place to keep that. You can say the Monsters of the Blood Fields. You can have a book, things like that. So that's cool. You can keep your ideas in there. That's one way to use a folder. Another way to use a folder is to collect things into a group or something like that. So for example, you might create a folder of, say, a faction, and you've got all these different, like the leaders of the faction, and you've got the monsters in the faction, you've got places related to the faction. So I have one of those made in here, so I am going to go ahead and do that. So let's take a look at our folders and click on it again here. And you can see I have one folder that I was made for a module. I'm going to make another folder here, and we're going to call this the Bellion faction. And the reason I'm doing that, we'll call it the Bellion faction folder. By the way, you want to be careful in this particular system. You don't want to have two things named the same thing. It can get confusing in the connection, so avoid that. And I'm going to add some connections in here. I have a character, Malgeron, who is actually part of the Bellion faction. I've got another character, a monster, a shock troop, that is a part of the Bellion faction. And in addition to that, I have something else called Bellion in here. Oh, the goddess. Goddess. So we'll put the god in there. So Bellion is their god. There we go. And we're going to stick all those in our Bellion faction folder so they're easy to keep track of. So everything Bellion will be, or Bellion, or whatever we end up calling it, will be located in that folder. Okay. Wow, that is a lot. You may want to go back and kind of run through these things one more time. No big deal. You can do that anytime you want. That's why we do these videos. Thanks so much for joining us today. I hope this was helpful, talking about the different types of entries to get your campaign organized from the beginning, roles and categories to, again, even keep that level of organization. And the key idea here, remember, is once you set up an organizational pattern in your campaign, stick with it so it's easy to follow as you move along. All right. Well, thanks again for joining me. I am Ravensma. The best thing that we can be doing right now is having a great time with people that you care about, and I hope you're doing that right now.